Sure, louder. Should we test the other one as well, so the panel don't have to bore you with, what about this one? What about that level? All good as well? Fantastic. Okay. Oops.
Don't point it at the
Keep it behind the speaker, exactly.
Yeah. I am Tom, I'm editor of the Labour news and comment website Labour List. If you don't know us, we're really delighted to be hosting this in partnership with Third Way. If you don't know them, they're a US think tank working on progressive policy, and also our partners IPPR as well. If you don't know them, I don't know what planet you're living on. Without further ado, I shall say, thanks again to my sponsors, to you for being here, for the fantastic panel here. Hopefully Josh Simons will be joining us shortly, and I hand over to Ed Owen, a Labour List columnist, a visiting fellow at Third Way, former advisor to Jack Straw, and many other things besides. Ed Owen. Let's give him all a round of applause quickly.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm going to stand up, but because it's I can't see most of you, so I'm going to stand up and then I'll come back and sit on the no, actually maybe I shouldn't stand up. That was how to make impact, eh? Right, hello. Well, it's great, wonderful audience to get for this fantastic debate, and I won't do my introductions because Tom has already done that. We've got a really good panel, and we'll have an even better panel when Josh arrives, which hopefully will be very soon. So, I think it's fair to say that interest in the US elections is reflective of the fact that this is the most consequential US election probably for decades, with extraordinary implications, obviously for America itself, for the UK, and for the world. So this is a really important question. We've only got 5-6 weeks to go until the poll itself, so this is now getting really interesting. It's been quite an extraordinary campaign already. The fact that we've had the first sitting president dropping out of the race, the first sitting president not to seek re-election since 1968, since Lyndon Johnson. The fact that we've got a new Democratic candidate. The fact that we've had 2 assassination attempts on the Republican candidate. The fact that the Republican candidate is now a convicted felon. This is quite an interesting campaign, I think. So, and with 5 or 6 weeks, there's still 5 or 6 weeks to go, I think, is in the words of another former US president, you ain't seen nothing yet, I suspect. So it's still all to come. So I am privileged to be joined by at least 3 of the 4 panelists. Josh, I'm sure he's on his way. So just to confuse you, we've got 2 Joshes on the panel. But I will start by introducing Josh Freed. Josh Freed is the Senior Vice President of Third Way. Third Way is one of the foremost think tanks in Washington, DC, championing centre-left ideas, innovations, and political development. And Third Way have been involved in the UK for at least 3 or 4 years, but have long history in the US, set up in the 1990s, I think, Josh. So Josh is over here from DC and will bring a particular perspective from America. On my immediate right is Laura Chappell. Laura is the Associate Director for the IPPR's international work, and that is a new division, and it's really exciting for someone who's, for instance, been involved in foreign security policy. That IPPR are taking this on and taking a lead in foreign policy, and I'm particularly delighted about that. So Laura, great to have you. And on my left, Scarlett Maguire, who is a leading figure for JLP, one of the leading polling companies in the UK, and now increasingly in the US, and Scarlett is responsible for the business development in the UK and the US, so we're very privileged and have done a lot of work, polling work in the US. And I'm going to start by asking Scarlett to give us a bit of a context and a frame, to tell us how the campaign is going, what are the numbers looking like at this stage, what are the issues that are being discussed. So Scarlett's going to set the scene, and then I'm going to come to the other members of the panel for commentary on some of what she will say. We're going to start with a focus on the campaign itself, so that's going to be a discussion. I'm going to talk about what those different scenarios will look like depending on the election outcome. So I'm going to start down on the possibility of a Trump victory, and I'm going to start raising that to the idea of a Harris victory, and to discuss what the implications of those two scenarios are. So, Scarlett, over to you.
Right.
And let's go on to use that.
Okay, sorry. No, fantastic. So I think I'll just start off by saying that, as I'm sure you don't mean me to tell you actually, that Biden dropping out of the race against Trump in July changed absolutely everything. So we poll for the American election, and we also model for it. Our model gives us estimates, it gives us probabilities of who will win the popular vote, but more importantly, who will win the Electoral College, and increasingly they're not the same thing. And just to give you an idea of how bad things were looking for the Democrats and for Joe Biden, we had it as a more than 85% chance that Trump would win the election following disastrous performance in the debate. And so things were looking increasingly untenable for the Democrats. Kamala entering the race has changed everything, and we're used to US elections being nail-biting. The previous two elections have been decided by tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states, and I think this looks like it might be the closest one yet. At least a few weeks out, it looks like the closest and the most difficult to call. Anyone who would stand in my place and tell you they think they know what is going to happen would be, I think, fibbing to you. It is a complete coin toss election. At the moment, that model that I was talking about has a 50.5% chance of Trump winning the election. It has Kamala Harris on 51% of the popular vote, but narrowly losing the Electoral College. But we're talking nail-biting, and most other pollsters will tell you it's also, whichever way they have it currently leaning, they'll tell you it's 50-50 race. They will also tell you, though, which is, I completely agree, that the momentum is undeniably, I think, with Kamala Harris and the Democrats. So we first saw a bit of a bounce to the Democrats' chances in early August. I think that was a bit of a sugar rush. I think there was so much relief and so much excitement that they had a nominee that had a real fighting chance in this election that some of that was slightly inflated. We then saw things go a bit more towards Trump's favour, but since his performance in the debate, which was not as much of a sort of car crash for his campaign as Biden's was, it was bad. And I think even the Republicans would say it was a bad performance, it was not as strong as they were hoping. Kamala Harris did, I think, very well, and we've seen that in her polls. And so voting intention is one thing, but one thing we think, there are things we think are more important than voting intention. We think voting intention lags behind some of the other key drivers of votes. And so the things we really watch when we do election, we look at election, we look at trying to predict what will happen in the election, is to look at some other things, and they are: who do the American public think is the strongest? What are their memories of a Trump administration? And we find ways of getting to this crucial question of what would change be like. That's obviously a crucial question at this conference for the Labour Party, but it matters hugely in America too. And we've seen that Donald Trump led Joe Biden by huge margins on that question of strength, perhaps unsurprisingly given what the public was seeing of Joe Biden towards the end of his time as the nominee. Now Kamala Harris has almost completely closed the gap. If she continues that, strength is the biggest determinant of vote outside of your previous election vote, so it's hugely important. Another thing we look at is memories of a Trump administration. So it might surprise you to hear that in the first 6 months of this year, the first half of this year, when we asked people what their main memory of a Trump administration was, it wasn't anything to do with chaos, it wasn't anything to do with controversy, it was that the economy was better. And that was far and away the strongest memory that was coming to us. Far, far, far down the list was January 6th, and then everything else was below that further. What we've seen over the last couple of weeks, especially since the debates, especially since that sort of showcase of his more divisive rhetoric, I'm thinking particularly of the insubstantive claims about immigrants eating cats, among other things, we've now seen January 6th almost overtake the memories of a better economy. Now, I think that's very interesting, partly because one of the things Joe Biden and the campaign were running on was this idea that Trump would be a threat to democracy. And when he was talking about January 6th more and more overtly about a threat to democracy in that way, it was as if voters actually weren't listening that much. That's partly because they weren't giving Biden the benefit of the doubt or the credit to be able to make those arguments. and they also had their own concerns about Biden's a potential lack of democracy around Biden being an executive power still. But I think it's more importantly because they've sort of got a bit used to this idea and they thought it was being rammed down their throats, but they thought it was a bit hyperbolic, so we might disagree with that. But the reminder that Trump has done himself, and he has done this entirely to himself, about how messy he can be. Is it? But Michael does.
Swap the microphone.
Hmm?
Swap the microphone.
Swap the microphone.
I don't know whether you want to.
Great, sorry about that. Okay, great. That sounds better. Yeah. So I think it's Trump doing it to himself, and the more we see him spin wildly off message, the more you see him monologue sort of, a lot of things that don't make any sense and that certainly aren't addressing voters' concerns, the more people are reminded of not just some of the more sort of what people might think dangerous aspects of his presidency, but just the exhaustion and the chaos and the mess that they remember from the last time. And they do not want that. They want something that's not that, and I think that's why at the moment, even though everything I said at the beginning, I think it is a 50-50 race. If the momentum continues in this way with Kamala, if Trump continues to almost self-immolate, which I think is what he's sort of been doing the last couple of weeks, then I do think it looks like hers to lose. But again, it is the tightest American election I think we've seen, which is saying something.
Thank you, Scarlett. Can I just have sort of follow-up questions to a couple of those points you made? One, do you think, I'd be interested in what your view about this, the assassination attempts have been, and to some extent, does that play into the chaos issue you reflected, rather than actually the brave fight, which at the time in the summer looked as if that might be the turning point that was going to give Trump the glide path to election victory. So I'm interested in that. Also, the issue of the fact that if you poll Americans, most of the issues that they care or they say are most important to them for the election, not least the economy, cost of living, border immigration, Republicans stroke Trump are far ahead. So what's going on?
Yeah, I think they're great questions. I think, as you alluded to at the beginning, this has been such an extraordinary year in the lead up to this election that this is actually a problem for pollsters because we've had so many of these massive events happen so soon after each other. It's quite hard to untangle what actually impacted what movement in the polls. We've got used, Americans are more used to assassination attempts on their presidents, but the fact that we had two in 2 months is extraordinary. The second one, I think, partly because it didn't have visuals that came with it, went almost unnoticed. People got a bit used to it, and then they sort of got on. I don't think it's impacted stuff hugely. I think actually more important than the assassination attempts in terms of the rallying of the Republican base, which we undeniably have seen for the last few years around Trump, actually counterintuitively, I think that was more the legal cases against him were what did that. And I think I, for one, wasn't sure that was going to go that way at all, but it did, and it made it very hard for any of the Republican people challenging him for the nomination to mount that challenge, because the base so rallied around him when he was under those sorts of attacks. You saw that a bit again with the images from the first one, but again, I don't think they've actually had that big of an impact on the race, which is again an extraordinary thing to say. On that question of issues, yes, it is certainly true that when you poll Americans, what comes top is the economy and then immigration, and they come far and beyond everything else. When you say economy, I think it's actually more helpful. Again, that's something that I think of in the UK as well. I think it's more helpful to think of the economy in terms of cost of living, because when you talk to voters in focus groups and stuff, that's what they mean. They don't really mean the macro economy. And again, that's part of the reason why Biden was struggling a bit, because they were trying to sell Bidenomics, what's happening in sort of big picture economy, without talking enough about the pressures on people's pockets, was actually something that, again, Kamala's doing well. She was saying, you can say it's policy light. I personally think it is. Voters think it's a bit policy light, but that turn of attention from big macro picture to middle class families that are struggling, you are struggling, I will help you, much better. That's what people want to hear about. So that's what they mean when they say the economy. Immigration, I think partly because what I was just saying, we're seeing some interesting things happen. Under the final months of Biden, you're absolutely right, Republicans had a massive lead on the issues of the economy and the immigration. That's part of the reason why models like ours had the race so much in Trump's favour. Kamala's making up an awful lot of ground, and again, if you break it down, whilst whilst we still have Trump ahead on the economy, we actually have Kamala Harris now ahead on who would be better for your personal finances, and I think that's incredibly telling. And she's improving even on the question of the border, which is it was a huge weak spot for the Democrats over the last couple of years. So I think, again, yes, they still have the lead list being eaten away at, and that is, again, I think Trump has done that to himself. Yes, the Democrats' campaign has improved on those issues, but if he had, for example, done that debate and not gone on quite mad rants about immigrants eating cats, and instead ruthlessly stayed on the points they could make about the economy, about how hard up a lot of Americans tell us they feel in focus groups, I think we could be looking at something slightly different, but he didn't, and he's not showing that he's going to for the next few weeks either. Maybe he'll change, he's not, has he recently though?
Thank you. Scarlett, really helpful. Now I'm going to turn to you, Josh. So, 3 months ago, it was the common view that Kamala Harris was not the right person that would become the Democrat candidate. There was an implicit assumption, not least because Joe Biden felt he was the only person who could beat Trump, that he didn't think that Harris could be the appropriate candidate. You speak a lot to senior Democrats in the US. You're living this and breathing this day to day, hour by hour, minute to minute. Tell us a bit about, firstly, how has Harris become this extraordinary successful candidate that Scarlett has described, which is counter to many expectations? And also, can you take us through what you think the next 5 weeks is going to look like from a Democrat perspective and how that's going to play out?
So if I was able to tell you what is going to happen or how it's going to play out over the next 41 days, not that we're counting, I would just go to the William Hill or one of the betting parlors and put a lot of money on the race. So I can tell you a little bit about what the flow or the vibe might look like, but it will be difficult to make any predictions on that, particularly now. Look, in a previous life, I worked for the campaign consultancy that helped elect Kamala Harris to District Attorney in San Francisco, to Attorney General, and to the U.S. Senate in California. What the rest of the country and the world is seeing now from Vice President Harris is what we saw in each of the progressions of her career prior to this. She is an extremely clear, values-driven, strong person who knows who she is and has a clarity of purpose and a really good ability to communicate and connect with people. I think the challenge was 2019 and 2020, especially in the Democratic primaries, was one of many odd, bizarre, unprecedented times that we in the United States have lived through since 2016. And you had a primary process that was frankly moving far to the left of where the Democratic electorate was, hence Joe Biden winning the Democratic nomination. And then Senator Harris didn't know what lane she was supposed to be in. She didn't have a personal feel for that race. And so you didn't see in that race the authentic Kamala Harris. She became vice president. She was picked by Joe Biden because he knew her, he saw her talent, his team saw her talent, and knew what she was bringing to the table from her previous career. We're seeing that return. She talks a lot about, in explaining her positions now and how she'll govern, she talks about the core values that drive her campaign. And I think you're seeing that. You're seeing that in the joy that she has. You're seeing that how she's connecting with not just Democrats, but with a broader set of Americans. One point that I think is also an intangible that we'll continue to see play out is during the Republican primary this year, Nikki Haley, I think correctly said, whichever party between the Republicans and Democrats nominated a candidate who was not going to be 80 years old or older during their term was going to win the election. Well, we listened to Nikki Haley. The Republicans may very well regret that they did not, and we have a much younger candidate who is much more dynamic. She's an incredibly good, effective communicator in her own way. I think I would look at both how that continues to play out over the next 5 weeks. In the debate, I think we saw that she understands and Democrats understand and have consistently understood this campaign cycle since she she got the nomination, how to get under both Trump's skin, because Trump is not someone who's disciplined and who is not able to stick to a script or a plan, or a concept of a plan. So she's been able to sort of push him to make the kind of gaffes that we're hoping, that she is hoping that they will make. So I would keep watching for that. Keep watching for Tim Walz to characterize the Republicans as weird. And then the Republicans saying that legal immigrants in an Ohio town are eating cats and dogs, which frankly, that's just weird. And so I think that the rhythm of the campaign, especially since Democrats have an enormous amount more money than Republicans do from a lot of individuals who've never given to campaigns before, a very unique position to be in right now. We have a lot more volunteers, we have a much better ground game, but to Scarlett's point, there's a lot of the fundamentals on the polling and public opinion side that have really been towards Donald Trump and the Republicans till now. So I think fundamentally the question is, who do Americans see as the change candidate? A former incumbent president who, the more they are reminded of what he did in office, the less they're enthusiastic about him? Or an incumbent vice president who, in many ways, visually and in what she says and the direction embodies change? We'll find that out in 41 days, but I think that's part of what the fundamental determination will be.
Thanks, Josh, and welcome to another Josh. Josh, Simon, thank you so much for joining us. And a bit of brief introduction for Josh. Josh Simons is the new elected MP for Makerfield. Well done, Josh.
I've got an activist somewhere in the back there.
And a former director of Labour Together, and also has lived in the States for 4 or 5 years. Was are you still visiting doctor at Harvard? But you were at Harvard and wrote books about democracy and the influence of AI, and so has done a lot of work in the US, and so has followed and maintained very close links. So I'm going to come to you, Josh, but you've not had the benefit of the sort of context that others have had, so, but that's the consequence of not coming on time.
We were told we're on time.
We're talking about the campaign at this stage, and I'm interested in we've now had Keir in the States who didn't travel to the States at all for 4 years as leader of the opposition. Like London buses, he's been in DC twice and travels again to New York for the General Assembly of the United Nations later this week. I'm just interested in your view about how, given this extraordinary campaign that colleagues have talked about, and this is going to get pretty feisty in the next 5 or 6 weeks, what your sense of how Keir and Labour here in London should handle and manage that campaign, what positioning they will take, how they seek to react to the stuff the noise that's going to inevitably come. Just tell us a bit about what your sense of how, from the UK perspective, how that campaign would manage.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here for a discussion that I was very excited about and am still. But alas, 30 minutes late for. So the most important thing I took away from America was my wife, Leah, and we are usually back in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, every year or so, sometimes more. And we were there over the summer. So this is a Western North Carolina, Smoky Mountains, rural, actually a kind of liberal town, but in a Republican county. And the energy and excitement was surprising, really palpable and even more sort of striking than actually I thought it would be going out there. So there's a boring answer to your question, Ed, which is, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, has worked very hard to build links with both sides. He is the Foreign Secretary, that's what he will do. He's very good at it, and you will endlessly hear Labour figures asked on the media about what they think of Donald Trump and isn't it awful and blah blah blah, and they will endlessly say, we will work with both sides, and whoever the president is of the United States is a matter for the American people and not for us, and so they should. A slightly subtler answer is that you've just heard the leader of the Labour Party essentially make a speech that was about populism. The argument he just made was about defining what right-wing populism is and defining it out of the sort of mainstream of British politics. That's what he was saying. The politics of easy answers is how he described it. That tells you a lot about how this government think about their relationship and their purpose and their mission politically, and how it relates to what's happening in not just American politics, but also German politics, French politics, Australian politics in a different way. And in some ways it is absolutely fundamental to what this government is. They're all over the world, there are centre-left governments who won power largely because their opponents blew up in one way or another, and they sort of professionalised themselves and became vehicles for change. And then they've struggled in power. There are not many cases yet in which those parties who have been incumbents, centre-left incumbents, having beaten right-wing populists, then fight campaigns. And of course that is the fundamental difference between the campaign we have just had in this country, where we were fighting that campaign as an opposition party, and the campaign that's now happening in the United States, which is sort of essentially an incumbent campaign, but with a change of leader that has changed that in a really important way. And I think what you will hear from the government as this campaign continues to play out is a sharper and sharper, relentless focus on this argument about populism that repudiates the politics of easy answers and quite confidently asserts what it means to be British, why our national story, the story of our values, are about fairness, are about respect, are about humility, and by implication are not about the things that some right-wing populist opponents would have us be about. So that will never be stated explicitly, because you wouldn't expect so. We're a responsible, good government. But there is a deep undertone to the entire project of this Labour government that is about beating right-wing populists, the politics of easy answers, the sort of the idea that our national story leads inexorably to hate and the rejection of that way of doing politics.
Thanks, John. So you've successfully navigated the handling and management of this next 5 or 6 weeks, and now going to take us to a dark place. So cast your minds ahead for 5 or 6 weeks, and we've woken up the morning after, or maybe 2 or 3 days after, or even 6 or 7 weeks after, in succession of court cases and everything else. But anyway, the outcome I'm now going to paint is that we have Donald Trump as the next, the 47th President of the United States. I'm going to turn to you, Laura, if I can, first. And could you give us a sense of what you think, what is that going to, how do you perceive, firstly, what the impact of that result will mean for a whole series of issues across the globe? Now we've got the crisis in the Middle East, potential all-out war in Lebanon, we've got the issues in the terrible war in Ukraine, and issues around competition with China, blah, blah, blah. Tell us a bit about what your reflections about what that will look, so what would the immediate impact of a Trump victory be, and then to set out over the longer period the implications for US foreign security policy and the implications particularly on the UK and the wider world.
Big question.
Honest question.
Thank you. I mean, maybe it's first worth saying, who knows? As in, Trump, as we know, is highly unpredictable, prone to making statements that weren't foreseen and then followed through or not followed through. So I think the first thing to say is that we will be entering a phase of deep unpredictability and instability. But taking it down from there, I think it's worth realising that in the first Trump administration, there were quite a lot of people in that administration who sought to limit some of the more egregious things that he attempted to do. and you saw the sequence of people moving through that did a bit of that and then ended up moving on. I think the number of those internal blockers, I think someone called them the adults in the room, will be fewer, and there'll be more of the true believers. So it may be that we see less of the edges taken off, which is a very sobering thought. Just running through a few of the sort of international policy issues. I'm sorry, this isn't going to be very optimistic. Maybe the number one to flag is NATO and European security. I don't think we've seen any shift in what Trump is saying about that, about his view of NATO, the strategic value of NATO to the US. So that is going to be a major policy priority for David Lammy to think through and work out what constitutes, alongside other European partners, a response if the US does start to strategically withdraw from NATO. Secondly, China. I think the strategic competition between China and the US will persist regardless of who wins the White House, but Trump will dial the rhetoric up to 11, and that's really meaningful. So even if both administrations might have a competitive lens, a rhetoric which is very conflictual is likely to take the relationship to more difficult and more unpredictable places as China seeks to manage that. So I think that's problematic. I've written down Middle East really bad. So again, we don't know. We don't know. I mean, the last Trump administration had attempted to bring new partnerships together amongst actors in the Middle East. But there are also people around Trump who are open to quite radical solutions. So, for example, in the occupied Palestinian territories, there are people around Trump, advisors, funders, who are advocating for the US to support the the annexation of the West Bank, and using resources that are being currently earmarked for Palestinian security for that. Now, that is not policy, and there are lots of people around Trump, but the possibility for quite dark ideas to gain traction is not zero. And then finally, multilateralism. We know Trump is not a multilateralist. He's been very clear about that. And there'll be specific institutions that he will pay no heed to, whether that's the UNFCCC or the WTO. To be really depressing, it's bigger than that. The big issues that this Labour government has committed to take seriously, so climate or nature, they really require that global approach, that cooperative transnationalism. And if we can't have the US leading that, it will need there'll be a big requirement for others to step up. So progressive realism, please, lots of progressiveness. Just a couple of thoughts in terms of maybe things that might be positive notes to end on. We haven't chosen our ambassador. That seems smart. Trump likes people and personal relationships. So if we can get a person in the US who is in a position to build the right relationships and build influence, I think that's a really smart decision that we haven't yet selected our ambassador. And I also just wonder if Trump's sort of egotism is an opportunity. I'm sure it is. He may have made grand strategic statements about grand strategic problems, but if you butter him up, will he just change his mind? So I think playing into who Trump is as a person provides more opportunity than it will with a more predictable, values-based politician. So maybe there's some space there.
I'm going to ask Josh whether Keir is that man, but that's to come. So I'm going to ask Josh from his perspective in the US. So tell us, we obviously we hear lots of stories about the impact that Trump will have on American democracy and lots of headlines, etc. Can you give us a sense from your perspective, as neutral as you can be? So ever again, I speak to quite a lot of people in DC, particularly on the business side, who sort of say, and maybe there's a bit of human nature where you sort of start to sort of adapt to what you most fear is coming, who say, oh well, Trump wasn't that bad, you know, he saw some noise, whatever, but you know, the economy was good, we made good business, etc. And there's a bit of that. So I just wanted to ask you if you could give us a sense from your perspective of what the implications of a Trump presidency are, I'd say, on the nature of American democracy, and are those fears are as well grounded as perhaps some of the headlines suggest. And also, if you can reflect what the implications will be on the American economy. We've heard a lot about Maganomics. There's been tariffs being thrown on 20% tariffs on all imports, etc. Take us through what you think that will look like.
Well, I appreciate not being asked the question about Kier. So, look, I think Laura just nailed it in saying that it is less about necessarily specific policies than the reality that this is not going to be Trump 1.0, because most of the people who served with him endorsed Kamala Harris. And the people who were in the rooms, who were the adults in the room, or just people with any sort of core values, tried to stop him, realized that they couldn't, and left. And that's the most frightening part of what a Trump 2.0 might look like. And I think that it is the business people and others who say, well, it won't be that bad, or Trump first term was okay because the economy was good. They are trying to convince themselves that it will be okay, or they may frankly be supportive of some of the policies that he wants. The thing that's been fascinating is, so I work at a think tank, and there's almost never an occasion when the big report that you have recommending policies gets national attention. And Project 2025 did that for all the wrong reasons. And the thing that is most stunning about it is that is the most moderate of the plans that Trump-allied think tanks have proposed. There's the America First Institute, which is Stephen Miller, his entity. There's also the Great American Renewing, which is by Russ Vought. Those are the two candidates that likely would be the chief of staff under Donald Trump. They make Project 2025 look like, you know, maybe the Boris Johnson Conservative Party platform, which is pretty stark. So I think that's the real challenge here. Is it's bad enough what was outlined for what will happen to NATO and outside the United States, but the danger for a level of chaos and unpredictability, and frankly just cruelty, coming from the American government, a set of actions that really go against the majority of Americans' values is quite high. And on top of that, there's no economic policy for Donald Trump. I mean, this idea, he either does not understand or is deliberately distorting how tariffs work when he is assuring us that 20% tariff he wants to place on all products from the United Kingdom coming to the United States will be paid by the United Kingdom. We all know that it's not how tariffs work. And so, you know, there's a lot of things like that he's talking about. We're going to have a very large tax debate and tax fight because the Trump tax cuts for very wealthy individuals will be expiring next year. There's going to be a determination on what that looks like. There will be fiscal cliffs where our government will run out of money because you have to constantly lift the debt ceiling. Very arcane stuff, but gets very dicey economically very quickly. And I think that chaos will really will compound on itself and make for very difficult moments for the American economy and for American business.
Thanks, Josh. So, Josh, is Laura's talked about the opportunities, if you like, that may be rather narrow, that might exist. Tell us a bit about how you think Keir Starmer personally, because as Laura said, we know that Trump from the past is someone who responds either positively or negatively to personal relationships. How will he personally seek to engage a Trump presidency? And then the broader perspective, and you've talked about the agenda and the approach that Keir is developing here in the UK, and that is an implicit, explicit confrontation, if you like, to much of what Trump would bring. Tell us how Keir personally and the government here in the UK can manage that, and are there some opportunities that you think that can be extracted from those challenges?
Yeah, so on the first of those about Keir, actually relevant to the last few days, Keir is a leader who is sceptical of panic and bluster and, sort of vague words that he doesn't really think's meaning. He's a very interest-focused person and goal-focused person. And Trump is obviously almost perfectly the opposite. He's bathes in bluster. In fact, he's capable of not blustering and bluffing and spouting nonsense. So I think in some ways they will be quite well suited. Keir will be quite well suited to going into a room with Donald Trump, understanding what his country's interests are, and cutting through the bluff and the bluster that inevitably he will get back, both in the room but also in media briefings that always come around it. So the main thing that will define Keir, which you've already started to see, is a very sort of statesman-like focus on the national interest. You've heard this time and again from the Labour Party, we are focused on country first, party second, the national interest, not self-interest. That is both a key dividing line with the Conservatives, but it's also sort of part of this bigger argument about what differentiates parties that are interested in delivering for working people from those who are interested in division and anger and hate. So that's the key thing. I think there is actually an opportunity that you might hear this government talk about. There's lots of awful things, but the opportunity is sort of more surprising, so let's talk about that. Which is defence, and defence-led industrial strategy in particular. This country has an amazing defence sector, which is the leading defence sector in the European Union, or just outside it, I should say. And a defence-led security pact with the European Union, I think, will become much more urgent. I mean, it already is urgent, it's already being talked about, but it will become much more urgent and tangible and real in the event of a Trump presidency. And to sort of zoom out a little bit there, at the moment, the EU, Europe as a continent, cannot manufacture the munitions that Ukraine needs to fight the war that it's in the middle of. That's mad, that's a problem. All the other armaments, technologies that are required to fight the war in Ukraine, can't effectively be produced, not just by the UK, but by European defence, the European defence sector. And Britain is a key part of solving that problem. And Trump has long argued about European defence spending and European commitment to defence spending. There's a bad version of that, which is, playing games with European nations that he doesn't much like, Angela Merkel, European leaders he doesn't much like. But the more fundamental opportunity for Britain is that it is a key part of making European defence more resilient, bigger, and more focused on the future. So I think in the event that Trump wins, and in the event that he starts to talk about some of the things that he's talking about currently, the argument for a security compact between the United Kingdom and Europe that is focused in part on a UK defence-led industrial strategy becomes much more acute and urgent than it would otherwise be.
And so just to pick up some of that, you mentioned national interest. It's certainly Keir's view that Britain's national interest is best served by multilateral arrangements, whether in Europe or globally. We're going to have a President Trump in the scenario who will be looking to undermine much of that. There are going to be issues of real tension. Ukraine, presumably within days of a Trump presidency, is going to be an issue which potentially is going to put Britain in a very difficult position, what position it takes. So is this going to be just some sort of trading issue? There's some UK leverage that can be used to sort of leverage influence in some other areas. Is that how you see it? Is Keir someone who would be looking to sort of get influence over here in order to build perhaps some more positive US position on Ukraine. Is that how you'd regard how he would play this relationship? You think?
I think he's likely to be a realist about the capacity of Britain to move an American position on Ukraine led by Donald Trump and Senate and House Republicans sort of full stop. I think he would be clear about the arguments for supporting Ukraine and the moral leadership and so on. But the takeaway is less about what leverage do we have to change the American position on it as Britain, and more about what does this tell us about the kind of world that we are now in and embarking on, and what does that mean for our own economic policy, for our relationship with Europe, for our relationship with other countries that aren't the United States or Europe, and the implications of those relationships for our industrial strategy. And I think, as well as being very clear about what he thinks of the American position on Ukraine in this scenario, that would be the focus. And there's an interesting connection there between that national interest and domestic politics. Rachel Reeves has talked before, Jonathan Reynolds made a speech about it, I think yesterday, about industrial strategy and the need for coherent industrial strategy and sort of geographically focused industrial strategy. And that, there's an interesting overlap there between that kind of need in terms of domestic politics, to demonstrate that there are growth models in the modern world that are not just about London in the UK, and this national interest, which is rebuilding some of the defence sector, but also all of the supply chains and sectors around it in an age when actually we can't rely on, American munition production, for example. And these are sort of not very Labour obvious things to be talking about, but again, from a government that is quite focused on what does it mean to have a centre-left project that is beating right-wing populists in a very uncertain world, that's useful politically. That's a part of what they might focus on and see as an opportunity to demonstrate that actually this government, as opposed to the opponents, are focused on the national interest and not some sort of facile bluff.
Thank you. Let's lift the mood. So that was all a nightmare. We've sort of woken up and actually realised that Harris won. So let's explore what that means. And I'm going to come to you first, Josh. I suppose to some extent, what differences should we expect from a Harris presidency, from a Biden administration, and what potential opportunities exists for the UK on policy collaboration and other issues? Also, what are some of the risks? Look, we tend to, not least in this polarised election, tend to sort of romanticise about one scenario and perhaps catastrophise the other. Well, there are obviously some indications, not least that, I think as Laura said, a Harris presidency will continue the pivot towards the Indo-Pacific, away from Europe. You're right, it won't be quite as dramatic, but it's still a strategic direction which is going to have implications for the UK and Europe. Tell us a bit about what that looks like.
So, to start, I think it's important not to overlook. I was last in the UK in late June, and watching some of the campaign footage and some of the images of the entire Labour shadow cabinet led by a incredibly young leader of the Labour Party with a lot of envy as I thought of Joe Biden, who was pushing 80 years old, leading the Democratic Party, and how much that looked like generational change. We are going to have generational change if in a Harris administration, starting with the person who will be president, but the cabinet is going to look a lot younger because those are her peers and the people she knows and trusts. And you have an entire generation of people in the Senate and in the House who are in their 70s and 80s who will be moving off the scene, and they're going to be succeeded by people in some cases in their 30s and 40s which may not be so odd in the United Kingdom or in other thriving democracies, but it's been a real challenge in the United States. Speaker Pelosi is phenomenal. She has been a fantastic force even in the last year, in the last 2 years. However, if there is a President Harris, we're likely to see Hakeem Jeffries, who's currently the minority leader in the House, as the Speaker of the House. That will also represent a real change. So I think you'll see just a dynamic and energy that we haven't seen in the United States in some ways, really since 2008 when Barack Obama was elected and inaugurated, and it just felt different. Then incoming, in this case, President Harris, she is very much of the same project as what Josh described as what labor is. It is to expand and revive growth for people so that people feel it rather than just the macroeconomic numbers tell that story. The focus will be on how do you provide the job training, the opportunities for jobs, relief in a lot of the stress of cost of living that a lot of Americans are currently feeling. That will feel very different both from what the Biden administration had to do to recover from COVID, but also what the Trump administration did. So it's really been at least 8 or 9 years since that's been the focus of the party in power. She's also very much concerned about, and has talked a lot about, focusing on taking on right-wing extremism, both domestically and globally. So I think there will be more of a partnership between the Starmer government and a Harris-led US government than we've seen since 2000, really, when we had both Tony Blair and Bill Clinton in office across the Atlantic. And that, given a lot of the challenges we face in terms of how do you equitably grow economies at a time when climate change is such an enormous problem, when we're all struggling with different types of issues around migration, around racism that is expanding and fed by the right-wing media as well as right-wing populist parties. In the face of changing demographics, how do we manage AI? To say nothing of how do we take on the challenge of authoritarian extremism coming from Russia and China and countries like Iran. That's going to be something that a Harris administration will be looking to partners for. The one last piece of it is I think there will be a military pivot in part towards Asia. However, there was an important document that came out, to get wonky for a moment, by Brian Deese. Brian was the former National Economic Council advisor for President Biden. He's a leading thinker of the future of democratic policy. He's maybe now in his early 40s. He's talked about the need to revive the idea of what he calls a clean energy Marshall Plan, but it's a recognition similar to the growth plan that Labor has already really spelled out quite well across multiple countries. How can the US and Europe and the United Kingdom and others all make clean energy very cheap and make sure it's really accessed by the global south as well as the G7 economies, so that there can be a really much more coordinated effort to both address climate change, but energy access, and start to decrease a lot of the tension that's happening. It is a very ambitious agenda. It's going to take more than 4 years from either government, but it is a very different approach than what we're seeing right now or what we'd see under the Trump administration.
Thanks, Josh. Laura, we don't know much about Kamala, do we? In some ways, the fact that she's the change candidate, yet being vice president for 3.5 years, is quite striking. Tell us a bit about what we could expect from a Harris presidency in terms of foreign security policy. What signs have we sort of detected, if you like, from both her previous experience as vice president and the circumstances that she will inherit?
Thanks. I'm going to amplify some of your points, but I'll start with Gaza. So she hasn't said a lot in terms of marking out a very different territory, but she has been a little bit different. She's been a little bit stronger on ceasefire, she's been a little bit stronger on humanitarian, and she's also made some statements suggesting that she might be open to a more substantial policy difference dependent on what happens on the ground. So we don't know a lot, but there's a slight shift in that space potentially. I wanted to pick up your point about the Clean Energy Marshall Plan. So, one of the really totemic things that the Biden administration has done is the Inflation Reduction Act. Supporting green tech at scale for job creation and for climate transition. It's been a huge initiative, and I think, internationally, it's both really inspiring and also problematic in the sense that we have not yet, as the UK, responded to that and thought, well, what does this mean for our own green transition, for our goals? And we've heard some statements over conference about how Labour is putting together its vision on that. But it's so helpful to hear that under a Harris administration, potentially there will be a sort of international counterpart to what the US has done domestically in terms of supporting green technologies and green jobs. So, as you said, potentially a piece that's about the global south. How will Harris really push the international financial institutions like the World Bank to make much more finance available at scale, affordable finance for countries to make a green transition? And then within the G7, will there be an opportunity for a more coordinated approach to green transition? So for me, that's a really exciting possibility under a Harris administration. The only other thing I just quickly wanted to mention was AI. I think the Biden administration's been very thoughtful about AI, and signs are that Harris will too. And so I feel like that's an area where we've started to do some international cooperation, but really hoping that will deepen, because it's a very imminent issue. So yeah, time to see real the next step in terms of coordinated action on that.
Thanks, Laura. Josh, so is a Harris presidency going to signal the return of the golden age of the Blair-Clinton years and deepen collaboration across policy and political issues? Do you see that?
No, in short, for myriad reasons. So I think that the two issues that Laura picked up on from what Josh said, AI and sort of broadly strategically led industrial policy aimed at growth, are the two key big opportunities. And they are interesting in part because they are very, 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 very different from the kinds of things that Tony Blair and Bill Clinton talked about. So even if Kamala wins, we live in a very insecure age, an age where big forces geopolitically are completely reshaping the nature of international relations. Domestic politics is more volatile, more uncertain, more angry than it was in that era. And then there are big forces like climate change, aging societies, AI, data, all of which produce a completely different sort of international relations context for that relationship than it was. So I think it's a real danger, in fact, that we do not allow ourselves to have a nice, 8-hour sleep, just can tell you that's what I'm craving. If Kamala wins, we still live in an uncertain world. It's still a world of enormous change, and the geopolitical and sort of strategic drivers of that relationship are fundamentally different and still fundamentally difficult. That said, I think I'm really just going to underscore those two examples because they are important and interesting and, full of hope in a sense, given how bleak a picture I just talked about. That I think they're worth kind of dwelling on what they actually mean in practice and just sort of to take us mentally a bit further along. You could imagine a world in which, so to take an example of AI, the area I know about, the Senate has a bunch of really interesting AI bills on the table that will almost certainly never get passed, but the legislation there is fascinating. And what it opens up is the possibility of all kinds of treaty-based conversations about data flows, data cooperation, the European Union term is data adequacy. And those are very difficult because, as in lots of areas like chicken, as we heard a lot about in Brexit, US regulatory preferences are different and divergent from European Union regulatory preferences. However, having that conversation explicitly where there's a set of shared values and shared goals around data and technology, is a massive opportunity and is basically new. The kind of diplomacy and geopolitics of data is, basically at a very early stage, nascent. And the same is true of the economic policy. And again, to underscore how important this is, all over Western democracies, the question of how you grow economies in ways that puts money in people's pockets, provides jobs, security, in areas outside of urban liberal cities is an unanswered question. Right now in the United States, you have the most interesting experiment, I think, yet delivered so far, since the sort of Second World War, in how you can change that. Its implications and effects on politics, on domestic consent, on places outside of those coastal cities is sort of TBD, we'll see. But pursuing that question together, which matters so much for both domestic politics and geopolitics, is an opportunity that is really, really fundamental to what happens over the next sort of 10, 15 years.
Really interesting. Now I'm going to open this out to you assembled experts. I'm going to take some questions in batches of 3. Okay, so but there are some rules, and these rules will be mercilessly enforced. Keep your questions brief, please, and they have to be questions. I'm not interested in statements. State the questions to the panel. So let me just someone got the mic. We're going to come around with the roving mic. So 3 questions. So I'm going to go from the guy there at the back. Okay, next to the red. Hold the guy saying in front of the red, whatever pillar, and no women. Oh yeah, okay, good. And yes, the woman was the extravagant wave. Okay. Yeah, well. So all right, you go first. We've got you. Have we?
I don't need a mic. I've got very
No, you're not going to fall loud voice.
Right. And what I want to talk about is Trump's popularity.
Yeah.
My lack of understanding why he's polling so well when you've had so many what are called key figures in the Republican Party come out for Harris.
Yeah.
I really haven't understood that.
Yeah.
And understood why he's still so popular.
Great. That's all right.
Project
Yeah, cool. Got your question. Right. So where's the mic? Okay, number 2.
Alec Lever, Richmond Park, CLP and Labour Business. Question for Josh, Simon. Good. Taking on from what you were saying just then about the need to look forward, how do we make sure that Labour gets its fair reward from the effort it puts in, which is why we've got a problem with democracy, that the third way has failed for 40 years in the States. The question is, corporate governance reform was in the 2nd paragraph of the King's speech. Can you tell us why it's there and what objective is behind it?
Thank you. Question number 3. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you if you think that Kamala Harris might benefit from some of the other candidates on the ballot papers. So North Carolina, you mentioned, and Mark Robinson for governor, and Carrie Lake in Arizona, and many abortion referendums also on ballot papers. Do you think Kamala might benefit from a bit of a bump in progressives turning out and people rejecting these nutty people on the ballot papers? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So there are 3 questions there. So I'm going to ask Josh, because you sort of answered it before, but we'll elaborate on the back of the questions. Can you answer the question about why Trump is still popular despite the fact that all people vote for him? I think that was basically it. And then I'll come to you, Josh, on the Queen's speech and corporate governance.
King.
Sorry.
You've been away too long.
I know. And someone said it's another old lag at conference. I've been coming to conferences too, but old legend, I think, is probably my better description. And then, so actually, Josh, why don't you think? So, I was going to bring it to Laura, but see, Josh, answer some more than three. Why is Trump so popular, despite the fact that the people who work for him hate him? And what's the dynamics? Because of course we've talked only about the presidential election here. Notice we know the American system is much more complicated than the UK one. There's a lot of other ballots going on, and what impact that will have.
So look, I think Trump being opposed by so many other Republicans is seen by voters as a feature, not a bug. There is a portion of the American public that's very frustrated that they've seen prices rise, they've seen, especially in our country, the cost of education, the cost of retirement, the cost of healthcare continue to go up, and they haven't heard from mainstream politicians of either party the kind of acknowledgement of the struggles that they face and expressions of frustration that they desperately want to hear. And so Trump has been able to retain his popularity with somewhere between 35 to 40% of the public by that. However, his ceiling is pretty close to his floor. And so it's why he lost the popular vote in 2016. It's why he lost both the popular vote and the Electoral College in 2020. And we will see what happens this cycle. But he's facing some challenges, and it really isn't just a United States problem. I mean, we're seeing it as both Ed and Josh have alluded to, and Laura as well, across Europe and Australia and other places as well. In terms of will Kamala Harris benefit from Trumpy candidates in other places like North Carolina? If you haven't seen that, you should Google that, but warning, it is not safe for work. And other places, the answer is likely yes. Typically, the underperformance of a candidate that's running statewide means a loss of by if you underperform the expectations by 4 points, the presidential candidate actually declines by 1 point. Right now, the Republican running in North Carolina for governor is underperforming expectations by somewhere around 20 points. I would not say that means Kamala Harris is going to win. We have a resident North Carolina expert here, but she's in far better shape than any candidate on the Democratic side since Barack Obama. So we'll see how that plays out. Some places like Arizona and where abortion referenda are on the ballots, it really depends on who's turning out. It may give a bump of a half a point or so, but it depends on who's motivated and what happens over the next 41 days so we can determine that.
Josh, corporate governance.
Just quickly on that thing, I think it is very, very, very important. One thing we can be proud of in this country is we just had an election in which the median voter transformed the composition of our legislature. The number of newly elected MPs, the number of seats that changed hands, would make any sane American who cares about Congress and the House of Representatives wild with jealousy. Because what we have shown is that when there is a major shift in public opinion, our legislature completely changes hands. And never, ever, ever forget that one of the things that Americans who care about democracy have to figure out is what to do about the fact that the lower house is effectively no longer a sensitive recipient of big shifts in public opinion. And the answer to your question, therefore, is partly that the institutions in America, in a way that is different to the United Kingdom, solidify and cement public opinion. And that is a big, big, big problem, and it is something we should celebrate. We often don't talk about it enough, about our democracy, that we have avoided that. On the King's speech question, corporate governance reform, in short, the answer is, why is it in there? Because of productivity and pay being the key economic focus of this government, and the amassing evidence that to boost productivity in firms, having workers involved in the process of adopting new technologies, for instance, is a more effective way to boost productivity, is the short answer. We could talk more, but that's the short answer.
Great. Thank you. Now, if I could take one more question. I can't. You're all men. Sorry to be.
No, all the way on the right.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to take you in the stripy top. Okay, then we need to round up.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lois from the Coalition for Global Prosperity. I'm in the US programme there. I'm just wondering what you think the implications will be for NATO and Ukraine and international democracy in general in the event of not just a Trump presidency, but as you've alluded to, more of an isolationist approach on the congressional side as well.
Laura, do you want to?
I can start, but grateful if others will build. So, I'm concerned for NATO in particular, in the sense that it's such a long-standing feature of our geopolitical reality that a withdrawing or even weakening of US commitment has really profound implications for how we see our security as Europe, including the UK. So I think that's just concerning. With Ukraine, my hope is there may be a way to find a way through on that. So we know that right now NATO is working on can it pre-commit support to Ukraine so that that's already in place regardless of what happens after the election. And then it doesn't feel like Ukraine is playing quite the same role in US politics that it was, say, 18 months ago. It's not as salient. It was a kind of issue that, like, Trump was sort of stating his opinion on, and then the MAGA crowd was sort of reflecting back to him to say, we're with you, we are also skeptical, we are also isolationists. And it feels like that's died away now to some extent. So my hope is that can move us into a slightly different space, but that's a hope rather than a sort of expectation. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Now we've run out of time. So finally, the last bit here is the one-word answer for the panel about what your prediction will be for the election in November. So start with you, Josh. Who's going to win?
Harris.
Optimism, Harris.
Josh?
No idea. Don't do prediction.
Well, thank you. And by the way, we the organisers need to apologise to Josh, because that's why, although you all probably think, oh God, the MP turns up late for the meeting, actually he was told at the wrong time. So, apologies for that, but hugely grateful for your input. And I wanted to thank firstly I wanted to thank you guys for all turning up and making this such a special event, and real gratitude to you all, and for a good question. Sorry we didn't have time for more questions. But I want to ask for a round of applause just for Josh Freed, for Laura Chappell, and for Josh Simons. So thank you very much for so much. Thank you.